Forgetting Sarah Marshall is a 2008 romantic comedy written by and starring Jason Segel. It's a funny movie, it's also idealistic to a fault, but it has some, I think, important things to say about art and about depression, and that's what this video is about. The film is quintessentially the type of sweet spot, mid-budget mainstream comedy that balances raunchy humor with surprisingly wholesome narrative. The discourse around these films as a subgenre is typically focused on how and why they unfortunately don't seem to get made much anymore, despite once being such a dominant and influential staple, particularly during the 2000s. Unfortunately, if you're into that kind of thing, what we might call the Apatow-verse, for lack of a better word, did have a target audience, and it's not everyone's thing. I do think this movie really works, though, in large part thanks to compelling character dynamics. In the opening sequence, our protagonist, Peter, is unceremoniously dumped over his gradual loss of interest in personal growth or ambition by Kristen Bell as the titular Sarah Marshall, who is both his girlfriend of 5 years and the star of the TV show he works for as a music composer. He's devastated, lost, and out of desperation for some much-needed self-care, books himself a solo Hawaiian vacation. The plot contrivance to set the story in motion is that Sarah happens to also be staying at the small resort that same week with her new boyfriend, Aldous. Their awkward encounter develops even further by the introduction of Rachel, the free-spirited front desk clerk at Turtle Bay, and Peter's love interest moving forward. Apart from Rachel and Aldous never really interacting directly, every other combination of the four main characters have interesting, complex, and very human relationship dynamics that enable plenty of solid comedic and emotionally thoughtful scenes. Sarah, though either oblivious or in denial about it, is in a meaningless tabloid relationship with Aldous, someone who doesn't view her as a partner in the same way Peter did. He isn't a great guy in this respect, but to his credit also never really pretends to be. Their fling predictably blows up under pressure, but in a satisfying way. Aldous is an eccentric, womanizing rock star who exudes an illusion of depth and speaks with a brazen confidence mostly from his performatively over-spiritualized prose. It's Russell Brand playing himself. There's a sort of charming innocence, even a maturity to the way he never views Peter as a threat and therefore has no reason to be anything other than genuinely friendly toward him. Peter's initial jealousy about how Aldous' lifestyle attracted and ultimately stole Sarah away quickly grows into a much healthier admiration for how Aldous is so effortlessly and unapologetically himself. During their main heart-to-heart, Aldous also reveals that what little of Peter's original music he has come across in Sarah's collection he found to be quite moving. This is a big deal because beneath the veneer of his more sellout material, Aldous does have some real talent and sophisticated taste. He enjoys the music and crucially is the only character who understands exactly what it's going for without Peter having to explain it to him. Validation from Aldous makes Peter feel seen, and in that way becomes the confidence boost that not even Rachel could give him. It's definitely more than he got from Sarah, who's less of an artist, not a particularly good actor, and more someone who leverages her good looks in show business as a means to achieving recognition and success in more superficial ways. Through brief flashbacks, we see that she never understood Peter on a deeper level, and that this was a root cause of some of their relationship problems. Sarah also does see Rachel as a threat, growing more and more combative toward her easygoing contentment with herself, independent of any external validation, her natural empathy, her emotional connection to Peter, and this plays out really poorly for her by the end of the trip once she drives Aldous home early trying to make Peter jealous. If this were a much less interesting script, Sarah's realization that she prefers the stability of a boring but committed relationship with Peter over the excitement of a casual fling with a hippie playboy type would be a bigger, earlier plot point in order to set up a more conventional love triangle as the film's primary conflict. Forgetting Sarah Marshall is not a movie that always commits to a particular choice when presented with an opportunity to do so, and we'll get to that, but a major strength is its decision to show us that Peter and Sarah should not and will not get back together at the end of the movie. In doing that, the story builds a much stronger, more emotionally resonant narrative by freeing up Sarah later in the movie to deliver a formal breakup scene that is refreshingly honest and raw, and freeing up Peter to focus on his new love interest in the meantime, which drives most of the plot. Peter hits it off right away with Rachel. They both show a natural proclivity to see the best in each other while still acknowledging what they perceive to be unresolved character flaws with straightforward and obvious solutions. The narrative is very invested in the idea that an outside perspective enables them both to have a clear understanding of what will solve the other's problems and ultimately make them happier. Peter needs to escape his depressive comfort zone and take a chance on pursuing his actual passions. Rachel needs to stop romanticizing her simple life on the island as something more than a temporary escape from the real world, and go back to school so she can make something nebulously more of herself. In essence, they each need to become a little bit more like the other, and in both cases, it's just that simple. To any degree that this message is unhealthy, it's written quite realistically, which I appreciate about the movie. It is, of course, infinitely easier to pattern seek and problem solve objectively when you don't have any skin in the game. Other people's problems are simple. They don't have real stakes, not for you at least. Not when you abstract away most of the nuance, logistical concerns, or emotional baggage that can only be fully contextualized by that other person's entire lived experience. We'll put a pin in that one. What Rachel then does for Peter in reality is help him process the fact that he didn't become depressed because Sarah left him. He's actually been depressed for a long time, specifically because he doesn't enjoy the material circumstances of what his life had become outside the relationship when he was with her. A successful career as a Hollywood composer for a popular TV show doesn't actually make Peter happy, because he isn't creatively fulfilled by his very mundane work. Since he neither seeks or receives the aesthetic or spotlight of success in the same way Sarah does as the show's lead actress, he's less distracted from seeing the show for what it is, creatively bankrupt. The movie diegetically plays up their show as a parody of a bad procedural crime drama, one that, despite its popular, easily digestible format, is every bit as vapid, formulaic, and artless as the worst part of that stereotype might suggest. Crime Scene represents to Peter, as well as the audience, everything wrong with the soul-crushing corporate commodification of art in a way that I find satisfyingly accurate. In the real world, there are a lot of creative people who would like to pursue their talents full-time, and while there are also plenty of jobs out there for creative professionals, there's an extreme deficit of institutional career paths for creating what could reasonably be considered art. Some of you are ahead of me, but what exactly do I mean by that? There is a major disconnect between anything created categorically as art for its own sake and the content most creatives are paid to produce simply because it is viewed by society as useful to capitalism. Regardless of individual ambition or talent level, in this space you're overwhelmingly more likely to end up working on things like marketing collateral that prioritizes rigid brand standards and corporate interests than you are to work on anything somebody would ever willingly choose to engage with artistically. If you're an aspiring photographer, for example, your passion might be all about capturing something real as it happens so that moment can continue to live on. Yet the economic demand for actual working photographers is way too often about manufacturing artificial narratives to maximize profitability. The most useful photos are staged with unnatural poses and false emotion. Your boss probably won't know or care much of anything about lighting or composition. Their main concern might be about using the most conventionally attractive subjects or hitting some frankly misleading diversity quota, not to authentically highlight different backgrounds, but because the optics of pretending to care about that type of thing are the least exclusionary and therefore most profitable according to market research. The average graphic designer's day-to-day work, often uninspired to begin with simply due to the soulless nature of the corporate subject matter, tends to get endlessly nitpicked to hell and back by committees of middle management with contradictory ideas and zero relevant education or background in the arts themselves. I've been paying the bills through the creative arts in some way or another for more than my entire adult life, and I'm so starved for a genuine creative outlet that I'm currently writing a video essay about a 7 out of 10 rom-com from half my lifetime ago. So Peter's disillusionment is completely justified. He isn't composing original theme music or workshopping any interesting or recognizable ways that the show should sound. Presumably he worked on that type of thing to some extent when it first started, but these days it's all just vibes and tones. His producers make it clear that they are only interested in recycled, generic ambiance that communicates to viewers the moment the episode has arrived at a dramatic section. Other than that, Peter's music, if you can even call it music, doesn't say or mean anything because it's never allowed to. Rather than challenging him in some way, the show uses Peter only for his most baseline technical skills, not for any of his creative ideas or artistic vision. These are things he can only instead redirect into his personal passion project in his free time, which is a much more admirable testament to his work ethic than it outwardly appears, considering the state of his mental health by this point. I really appreciate that this movie challenges the myth of meritocracy in the creative space by highlighting how talented people are so routinely and methodically restricted by the sheer economic demand for mediocre content that can't be bothered to respect its own audience. If you're new to my channel, I have a fairly unique and, at least for my age, pretty extensive background in and around the Christian music industry from when I was a much different person than I am now. There are several specific reasons why most faith-based media is so consistently poor quality, and I won't unpack all of them here, but I feel quite strongly that none of those reasons are the lack of pure talent so often misguidedly assumed by secular criticism. At risk of sounding defensive over something I have no ties to at this point, Plenty of us on the music side of that weird little world are classically trained, even more have touring and session work experience outside the megachurch circuit. It's pretty common knowledge among professional musicians that church gigs represent an important entry point or steady work for a lot of people, since they have both the institutional funding and captive audience necessary to facilitate the infrastructure to even perform live music at any level of real professionalism. Not too long ago, most of my immediate social circle was made up of legitimately world-class musicians, and to say that disillusionment and burnout was common would be an understatement, because while that lifestyle demands a lot out of you, the material absolutely does not. Contemporary Christian music is not written to be intricate, subtle, or technically impressive. It's written to emotionally prime a crowd, to be easy to sing along to in a group setting. Everything from the lyrics to the production value is meant to be as sterile and edgeless as possible in order to appeal to the lowest common denominator. Unthreatening and easily marketable to conservative soccer moms, one of the only demographics of people who still reliably listen to FM radio or physically purchase music. There's an overwhelming default tendency to fall back on a very formulaic, tried and true mid-tempo ambiance that I can only describe as the major key version of exactly what Peter does when he records for Crime Scene by taking a nap on his keyboard. This bastardized imitation of the creative process, slowly transforming your life's passion into a dull obligation that only feels like work, can quickly make you resent what used to bring you joy. It also manifests a crippling distrust in your decision-making ability, since a life of pursuing your goal starts to feel like it kind of got you nowhere. You must have made a mistake, or maybe you're just not as good at this as you thought you were. Many people, myself included, know exactly how depressed that spiral into purposelessness and self-doubt makes Peter feel. Where he is not quite as justified, and I do want to be sensitive about blame here, is in letting depression and apathy consume him, to a degree that it also hurts Sarah in some very real ways. Now, it's worth noting again that for most of the movie, her character is given very little in terms of redeeming qualities. She can be shallow, petty, and as we eventually learn from Aldous, was unfaithful to Peter an entire year before breaking up with him. It's not until this reveal and its subsequent confrontation between the two that we meaningfully get her side of the story for the first time. From Sarah's perspective, it got really hard to take care of Peter when he stopped taking care of himself. His comfort zone at home for years had become numb self-loathing while glued to the couch. Her actions were ineffectual, but she did try really hard to be supportive enough to make their relationship work. Counseling, books, and sex seminars. She was even about as encouraging of his bizarre passion project as she knew how to be. The more effort she put in, the more Peter's depression dictated that her actions went unnoticed and unappreciated. Even more so than their fundamental incompatibilities, his pessimism and apathy toward his own life, their life, was what drove them apart, she explains with a poignant finality. "You have no idea how hard I tried," she says. "I couldn't drown with you anymore." Sarah's infidelity is morally indefensible. She's a cheater, one with a lot of growing up to do, and none of this absolves her of that. But in this moment, she's right. She feels the way she feels in valid response to terrible circumstances, same as Peter does. Fair criticism tends to strike a nerve. It can hurt to hear because it's true. But understanding and accepting the real ways that you owe it to yourself to introspect on a depressive mindset and work to change depressive habits is the only way to escape them. For Peter, a new relationship isn't going to work out or solve anything without that internal effort to escape his depressive comfort zone. And to properly frame that effort, let's look at what already doesn't work with his new relationship from a writing perspective. Rachel's backstory as motivation is pathetically half-baked, and it's hands down the weakest part of this movie. We've gone over the roadmap for Peter's arc and what was supposed to be set up as its mirror for Rachel. She needs to go back to school, and the movie really wants to establish that the reason she hasn't done this yet is the exact same as Peter's reason for not finishing his passion project and putting it out there. This is essentially a direct quote from the cliff jumping scene where they finally begin their official romantic relationship after taking a literal leap of faith. But hold on, Rachel is already happy. That's kind of the whole point. Everything about her current mindset and lifestyle is framed as the antidote to Peter's depression. Do whatever makes you happy, even if it doesn't look like what society considers to be conventional success. Peter's Dracula puppet musical is played as a comedy gag most of the time, but it represents his very real dream to reclaim his agency as an artist before his boring career crushes it out of him. He knows making real art on his own terms is the ultimate goal, even when he lacks the more practical motivation to overcome his self-doubt and take real action steps towards making it happen. Where Peter's problems and their solutions are tangible and specific, Rachel's are vague and immaterial. She still has bad blood in a public way with her ex-boyfriend, which is admittedly pretty toxic for a small community where everyone knows each other, but it doesn't seem like she ever felt a reason or desire to move back to the mainland. Every mention of going back to school up to this point has been brought up by Peter and dismissed by Rachel. There are no apparent reasons to believe she is lying to anyone, including herself, about being uninterested. Peter never accidentally stumbles across a college rejection letter or application for financial aid. Rachel doesn't express conflicted feelings about leaving a vulnerable loved one behind in Hawaii while she chases a dream. She doesn't have a dream, as far as we know. The movie repeatedly goes almost out of its way to not even tell us what she was originally in school for. It could very easily make a choice to add anything like these examples to her character with just a few short lines of dialogue or only slightly tweaking an existing scene. So much so that not making this choice feels deliberate. The subtext here seems to be a vaguely classist judgment of her career in an unskilled service industry position as being beneath her. Sure, she's content for now, but at the expense of her potential in the future. As much of a contradiction as this message is to the film's broader internal philosophy, a betrayal even, it's at least a point the film could choose to explore the nuance of. But Forgetting Sarah Marshall is not interested in confronting the implications of poverty, and it's to the detriment of her believability as a character. Rachel wears pretty clothes, goes on nights out, drives a decent car, and is never meaningfully constrained by a lack of disposable income. She isn't looked down on by any of her peers or disrespected at Turtle Bay by an arrogant manager. Even the yuppie celebrity Sarah, when at her best, has to admit that she admires Rachel, even in a lot of superficial ways, not unlike how Aldous actually has a lot of respect for Peter and his music, but for deeper, more important reasons. Nothing about the costs and logistics involved in uprooting your entire life to move across the country to an expensive city like Los Angeles is ever addressed, not plane tickets, not even tuition. Rachel is a trust fund kid as far as this script is concerned. What right does it have to demand she quit her low-stress job in one of the most beautiful places on earth to go get some nameless liberal arts degree she'll never need? And so she chooses not to, at least originally. After Crime Scene gets canceled during their trip and Sarah's jealousy sends Aldous home early, Sarah resorts to seducing Peter. He eventually rejects the move, but not until after some boundaries get crossed, and so Rachel cuts things off when he confesses to her about it. They part ways with the agreement that Peter won't contact her again, and several months pass before a flyer for his upcoming musical debut shows up in the mail. She surprises him by coming to the performance. They make up, they make out, roll credits, and that's basically the movie. It's left fairly open-ended, but we assume they're officially together since Rachel confirms she is in LA indefinitely while looking at schools. What kind of school? The movie still doesn't know and still doesn't care, because she's less of a real character at this point and more of a generic love interest that ties together a cute, satisfying ending. The movie wants them to end up together, wants her to uproot her life just for Peter, but is self-aware enough to lazily shoehorn in this flimsy school narrative as plausible deniability for how unreasonable that would come across. They're basically strangers, and I don't think even the movie itself is convinced that they're soulmates or anything. It feels too much like wish fulfillment. I'd go as far as to say an interpretation where Rachel only exists in Peter's imagination wouldn't fundamentally change anything about the movie, because for all intents and purposes, this scenario represents a fantasy. But having the nice classic happy ending that makes for a better movie, even if it doesn't ring true in a practical sense, can't take anything away from the fact that Forgetting Sarah Marshall isn't really a love story. It's a story about self-love and self-actualization, because those are the things that actually treat depression. We've already learned that waiting for someone else to help heal you is a doomed strategy, not just because that's a ridiculous and unfair thing to expect out of someone else, but because it wouldn't work even if they tried. The other component of the movie's philosophy was always that Peter had to want to make all the positive changes in his life for himself. Sarah showed him how much his self-destructive habits had become his biggest obstacle. Rachel showed him how living up to the potential she always saw in him would make him the type of person she wanted to be with. And the real victory in that, the real moral to his character arc, had nothing to do with their relationship working out in the end. It was that he had grown into someone who would have been perfectly fine even if it didn't. So let's go back and finally piece all this together to see how he got there. Give yourself the advice you would give anyone else if they had your problems, because that's so much easier to do. It might be oversimplified, but that's okay. You're mostly just isolating your goals and imagining what ways your life would look differently if you were to beat or better manage depression. Look for specific habits or that one big move that seems so much easier said than done. If you strike a nerve or start getting defensive, you're on the right track. For Peter, that starts with his music. Art is about authentic self-expression more than anything else. You might not be a creative professional or even consider yourself a creative person. I certainly don't always feel like one, but spending time doing whatever hobby or creative endeavor makes you feel like or communicates your most authentic self matters. When you're depressed, you don't feel like yourself. This diminishes your sense of purpose and keeps you from gaining any fulfillment from your day-to-day life, which is no way to live. Of course, there are systemic problems that impact and amplify personal problems, and I'm not trivializing that. You might have to start really small, but if you don't do everything you can to intentionally construct the type of life you could enjoy living, at least some of the time, you're missing a key element of self-love and are vulnerable to end up in a depressive comfort zone. So, as best you can, make time to invest in or do something that you want to identify with more than you identify with depression. Try different things, adapt, don't be afraid to fail, and as long as you enjoy doing it, that's a huge victory in and of itself. We've seen Peter's learning opportunities already, but the real practical growth happens through montage. Multiple ideas and events not necessarily deserving of their own full scene, but cut together to convey a theme larger than the sum of its parts. Beyond just being the efficient editing choice, this is thematically important. During both of these sequences, I'm really glad Peter is shown exercising, putting on real clothes, spending more quality time with other people, cutting back on drinking, sticking to a routine, and most importantly, pursuing a goal. The slow, simple, boring stuff that we wish we could just fast forward through like a movie montage at first is so much more important than a depressed brain wants you to believe. Us creative types tend to revel in the aesthetic of mental illness to some extent and can sometimes over-intellectualize depression and forgo the basics as if they wouldn't apply to us for some reason, or forget that taking action can improve mental health, not just the other way around that we've grown accustomed to, where bad mental health can inhibit taking action. But you'll never rationalize yourself into waking up one day feeling like the type of person who would take the big jump and go kiss the girl, so to speak. You have to just do that thing, whatever it may be. When you've been depressed for a long time, like Peter has, the most important thing you can do for yourself is get out of your comfort zone, because your comfort zone is depression. While you obviously can't just decide to feel happier, you can approach it in reverse and start making an effort to do the types of things that the happier version of yourself would probably do, because you'll never feel like that person if you never spend time acting like that person. And don't get me wrong, this is all extremely difficult because it requires confidence, optimism, ambition, consistency, basically all of the things that having depression makes you bad at. So you shouldn't expect it to feel easy or even go well. Back to the cliff scene, Rachel, a non-depressed person, is able to jump off quickly and gracefully where Peter only awkwardly falls and eventually crash lands into the water. Funny enough, there's even a minor continuity error in the edit where the main shot reverse shot has Peter framed in more overcast weather than Rachel, who is in the sun from a different take. I kinda love that. It's the same with his surfing lessons. Paul Rudd's here, by the way, just chewing up the scenery, having a good time. Anyway, Peter doesn't get up or succeed right away. He's a novice at this, just like he is at becoming the not depressed version of himself. But developing healthy habits and seeking out new, interesting experiences that can help you achieve your goals takes practice. It's a continuous process, and getting to the point where you're so familiar with it that it feels more like a routine than a focused effort is the most effective way to grow. Motivation comes and goes because it's external, but discipline is motivation with inertia. It's much harder to set in motion, but once you have some real momentum, it's self-sustaining. Remember, depression is self-perpetuating in the uniquely sinister way that it makes you bad at and averse to all of the things that are medically most effective at treating depression. So you need an equally self-sustaining discipline in order to fight back. Statistically, you will fall off an exercise plan, diet, social schedule, or creative project, whatever it is, especially while depressed, especially if you are motivated by results. But if you focus on the process, on building discipline toward becoming someone who spends time every day taking action and getting better at doing the things happy people do, even when you don't feel like doing them, motivation becomes irrelevant. Now you're someone who just does those things. And while you're busy focusing on the process for its own sake, You will eventually get a lot better at these healthy habits, and it will become a lot harder to identify with that depressed, undisciplined version of yourself because you spend a lot less time acting like them. This is also a good time to reinvest in your creativity or self-expression, because authenticity isn't just about innate characteristics or beliefs, it's also about growth and new perspectives. Happiness can be paradoxical. It's elusive and demoralizing to chase after as a destination. Rachel's character represents it well in that way, if not literally, then at least symbolically. But if you can envision something like your ideal life and commit to making incremental changes to act more like that person, especially when you don't feel like it or don't know what you're doing yet, with some creativity, discipline, a little luck, and maybe even some puppets, I don't know what you're into, you've set yourself up for success, and happiness might just meet you where you're at.